Out of sight, out of mind. This kind of sums up what happens with that steward, the last part of Jesus' parable in the gospel today. The master is away for a long time, longer than usual, and this servant thinks to himself, I've got all the time in the world to get ready for the master's coming. And so he kind of puts everything off, procrastinates, and instead he starts abusing his fellow servants as well as indulging in all sorts of worldly pleasures. Peter asks, is this parable for us, Lord? And yes, sadly, it is for us. There are times in which we can be just as quick to forget the good that we ought to do, forget how we should act as Christians, especially if we think nobody's looking, no one's watching. We fool ourselves to think that God really doesn't see that. Out of sight, out of mind. But it's so important that we don't act like that servant, but instead, like the faithful steward, those that Jesus speaks of earlier in the gospel, who are ready for any moment that the master may arrive. Are we ready that way for God's arrival? At all times. Even if God seems to be out of sight, he must not be far from our minds. Because that's the difficulty, isn't it, with God? That we don't see him the same way that we see each other. Having that person right in front of you reminds us of how we should be. But when God is invisible, it's hard to remember sometimes that he actually is here. Those who will question even God's existence, will ask believers like us sometimes, I believe in God, but I just don't see the evidence. Can you show him to me? I need to see him, and then I'll believe. And I can sympathize with them, having begun in the scientific world, that you have to see something. You have to be able to observe it and run it through the experiments before you can believe, before you can trust what's there. But when it comes to God, it's different. Because God isn't part of our physical world. He's pure, infinite spirit. And so we can't use that method of science to look, to observe him. Instead, the way that we know God is by faith. And that's what our second reading is all about. It says that faith is the realization of what's hoped for and the evidence of things not seen. So we use science as the evidence for visible things. But faith, that reading says, is the evidence for invisible things. Faith is trusting in the Word of God simply because of who he is. That he's the all-good, all-loving creator of all things. And that if God is who he says he is, then he can be trusted. And really, his word is much more sure than anything that we look at, because our senses can be wrong, can be mistaken. So Abraham in that reading is given as the model, the father of us in faith. And he says that by faith Abraham obeyed when he was called to go to a place, not even knowing where he was to go. So think about that. Abraham doesn't necessarily see God face to face, other than hearing his call for him to leave the land that he had grown up in and knew. And he has to go to a place that he's never seen. He knows nothing about. But yet he trusts God, trusts his word, and he goes there. It says, by faith Abraham journeyed to this promised land, remaining there. He stayed there with his family, even though there were difficulties. Just because we follow God doesn't mean there aren't difficult things. Conflicts with people that he had to live with. But he trusted God who took care of him and his family. It says, by faith Abraham received the power to have a child when he and his wife Sarah were far beyond years for having one. God promised that he would have that son. And even though they couldn't see how this would happen, Abraham and Sarah trusted God. And it was so. It says, finally, by faith, Abraham, who when put to the test, offered up his son Isaac. And this was the most difficult test of his faith. When God asked Abraham and Sarah to offer up their only son as a sacrifice back to God. But because Abraham had been practicing faith in this God he could not see, Abraham even then was able to obey, even if it meant the death of his son. Just because we can't see God, of course, doesn't mean that faith is just simply blind. Abraham based his growing faith on all of the evidence of God keeping his promises from earlier on. It says in that reading that he thought that the one who had made the promise was trustworthy. He had seen how God had brought him to this wonderful new land and how he had taken care of his family, even amongst difficulties, of how he had been given this son miraculously. And now that God was asking him to give Isaac back to him, he still trusted him in faith. It says in that reading that Abraham reasoned that God was able to raise someone even from the dead. That's what he thought God was going to do. He was going to raise Isaac from the dead. Of course, God didn't do that. He stopped Isaac from being killed in the first place. But Abraham wasn't wrong, because God certainly could raise someone from the dead. He did that to Jesus, so that we ourselves could rise to new life. So how do we grow each day in that kind of a faith, the faith that's like Abraham's? Well, there's many things that we do as Catholics to do that, but one very good practice to make sure that God doesn't remain out of our sight and out of our mind is a very simple thing that the saints recommend, and that's to practice each day God's presence. To recall to our mind at different points that God is here. So St. Francis de Sales, who I've been reading recently, he gives kind of 4 real practical ways. How do I recall God's presence? One way, he says, is to think about how God is in every place, any place that you are, and that all that you see around you is only here because God keeps it in existence. And if God wasn't here keeping it, all these things here, it would all just disappear. Of course, maybe that's a little bit too broad, too high for us to think about. So he says, well, another way to think about God's presence is that he's present in a very specific way in your soul, in our hearts. From our baptism, God comes to live within us. So he's right there within you. Or another way, he says, to think about God's presence is to think of Jesus up in heaven looking down upon us, looking down upon all of his children. For that's indeed what he does. He sees us at all times. Or a final way of recalling God's presence, he says, is to imagine Jesus there beside you as a friend. Because that's true. That's how close he is. And especially if we're here in the church, it's literally true because his real presence is here in our midst. So we don't have to do all those ways, but at different points throughout our day to recall to our mind that God is present. Practice the presence of God, and your faith will grow. For our God is not far. He is not an absent master. Even if our eyes fail to see him and his works at times,